It fits in a palm. Gray stone, chipped to a point at one end and narrowed at the other to seat into a shaft. It came out of a terrace above the Salmon River in western Idaho at Cooper's Ferry. The Nez Perce call that place Nipéhe. The stone is about 15,700 years old, and the ground it was lying in may be older than the stone. The team that dug the terrace published that in the journal Science, and the number landed thousands of years before anyone was supposed to be living this far inland. Far enough before it that the accepted history of how people reach this continent has no room for it. That was 2019. By April of 2020, the same journal was carrying a comment saying the number could not be trusted, and before that year was out, a second group of archaeologists had gone further in print, arguing the honest floor here was thousands of years younger still. The people who dug the site answered both of them. Then in December of 2022, they came back with 14 more points like that one, out of pits that would be very hard to call disturbed. 3 years of published argument over one hillside, and a stone point cannot be dated directly, by any method we have. So how do you prove the age of something that carries no age of its own? Cottonwood, Idaho. The lower Salmon River, about 11 miles south of town, where a creek called Rock Creek comes down and meets the main water. The salmon cuts hard through that country, and where it bends there are benches of old flood sediment sitting above the current channel. One of those benches is the site. It's a flat shelf of ground maybe the size of a couple of city blocks, with sagebrush on it and a long view down the canyon, and if you drove past on the road you would see nothing at all. The Nez Perce name for that shelf, Nipéhe, is older than the road, older than the county, older than the state. It's an ancient village, it is on Nez Perce land, and by the Nez Perce's own account they did not arrive there from anywhere else. But for most of the 20th century, the accepted story of how people reached the Americas ran through a gap in the ice. Two enormous ice sheets sat across the top of the continent, and as they pulled apart they opened a corridor down the middle, and people walked down it. That corridor is the reason the accepted timeline sits where it sits, because nobody could get here before the door opened. The problem is the door's opening time. The corridor doesn't become a route you could actually survive until sometime after about 14,000 years ago. Cooper's Ferry, on the numbers the excavators published, is older than that. Which means that if the dates hold, the people who camped on that shelf did not come down the corridor because there was no corridor to come down. So who was already here and how did they get in? 1961. A man named B. Robert Butler puts trenches into that same bench of ground. Butler was working before radiocarbon dating had become routine field practice, and he did not have the tools to answer the question he was standing on. What he found were stemmed points. Stone tips with a narrowed base, shaped to be hafted onto a shaft, and they did not look like the fluted Clovis points that were supposed to be the oldest technology on the continent. He wrote it up in 1969 in a journal called Tabiwa. He knew Cooper's Ferry was old. Stemmed points sitting that deep in that kind of sediment told him so. What he could not do was put a number on it, because the dating that would have answered him needs organic material recovered under controlled conditions, and the field had not yet made that routine practice. So the strongest claim available to him was that the place was old, and old is not a date. Without a number there was nothing for anyone to argue with, and an argument is what makes a place like Cooper's Ferry famous. The field moved on. If Butler had been able to run a date, this fight would have started 60 years earlier. The site sat. Then in the 1990s, an archaeologist named Loren started working it as a Bureau of Land Management archaeologist, and kept coming back. From 2009 through 2018, Davis ran it as an Oregon State University field school, which means the digging was slow, careful, and done by a rotating crew of students under supervision, season after season, with Nez Perce participation on the ground. That is 9 years of somebody removing dirt in measured layers and writing down where every single thing came from. They opened two main excavation areas. Area A, up on the terrace, which is where the first paper's evidence came from. Then Area B, lower and off to the side, which is where the argument would eventually be settled. The objections that came later were aimed almost entirely at Area A. The answer to them came almost entirely out of Area B. What does 9 years of that get you? The bench is capped with loess. Loess is wind-blown silt, fine as flour, and it piles up slowly and evenly over long stretches of time. That's useful, because a deposit that arrives gently and in order tends to stay in order. Things buried in it stay at the depth they went in at. Running through that loess is something called the rock creek soil. A buried soil is what you get when a land surface sits stable long enough for actual soil to develop in it, and then gets covered over. It's a horizon of former ground level sealed in place. Regionally, soils in that position date somewhere between about 16,400 and 14,000 years ago. So how does a buried soil put a date on a stone tool lying inside it? A lot of the material coming out of the lower levels is coated in carbonate. That's mineral crust, laid down out of groundwater over long periods while an object sits in developing soil. You don't get heavy carbonate coating on something that arrived last week. The coating ties the object to the soil-forming process, and the soil-forming process has an age. So the crust on the point is telling you roughly when that point went into the ground, independent of anything else. The tools themselves are Western stemmed, contracting stems, worked with collateral flaking, which means the flake scars run across the face from both edges toward the middle. They are not Clovis. Clovis points are fluted, with a channel struck up from the base, and it is a different way of thinking about how you attach a stone tip to a wooden shaft, which usually means a different tradition of people teaching each other how to do it. So who taught them to make one like that? Alongside them, the ordinary residue of somebody living there, storage and refuse pits, a hearth, debitage, which is the sharp waste flakes that come off a stone tool while it's being made, and which is the single most reliable sign that a human being sat in a specific spot and worked. Fire-cracked rock, animal bone. All of it out of ground the Nez Perce have called Nipéhe the whole time. And in the 2019 context, tooth enamel from a horse, an extinct horse. There have been no native horses on this continent for roughly 10,000 years, and there was one on that terrace with people. So how do you get from a bone in the dirt to a number on a paper? You can't date the point. You date what's next to it, and then you argue about how tightly the two are tied together. Radiocarbon works on things that were alive. Charcoal from a hearth, bone from an animal somebody ate. So the excavators dated the organic material found in the layers and features, and then they used a statistical method called Bayesian modeling to combine dozens of individual dates into an estimate for when the whole occupation started. In 2019, that model put the start of the lower cultural layer in Area A somewhere between about 16,500 and 15,300 years ago. 3 years later, on more material, the same team ran it again for Area B, and that one came out between about 16,000 and 15,700. Then there's the number on that photograph. The stemmed points that came out of the sealed pits in Area B date to about 15,800 years, not modeled outward from a layer, dated on bone found in the pits with them. Now set those against Clovis, which the field puts at roughly 13,000 years ago. The oldest layer at Cooper's Ferry, on the excavator's own model, runs about 3,000 years before the technology that was supposed to be first. Those three numbers are not the same kind of thing. The 16,000 figure is a modeled estimate for when a layer of silt started accumulating human traces. The 15,800 figure is a date on bone lying in a pit alongside finished tools. One of them was worked out. The other was dug up. So which one is the site's real age? In April of 2020, an archaeologist named Manning published a comment in Science, and the comment did not accuse anybody of anything. This is not a story about suppression. Nobody hid anything. The dig was published in the most visible journal in science, and the objections were published in the same journal, under the objectors' own names, where anybody could read them. That's the system working exactly the way it's supposed to work, and it's uglier and slower than television makes it look. Manning's argument was about the statistics. When you build a Bayesian model, you have to tell the model what you think is reasonable before you feed it the dates. Those assumptions are called priors, and the model's answer depends on them. The specific thing under attack was the start boundary. That's the model's estimate of when occupation began, and it is, by definition, an extrapolation backward past the oldest date you actually have. You are asking the math how much earlier than your earliest evidence people probably arrived. So how far back should a model be allowed to reach past the last thing anybody actually dug up? Manning's position was that once you handle those assumptions differently, the confidence falls apart at the early end. He was not confident of a human presence at Cooper's Ferry before about 15,000 years ago. He allowed that the middle of the 16th millennium was possible at best. Manning did not date it younger. He argued that the earliest part of the claim was not supported strongly enough to be confident about, which is a different and much more careful statement. And there was a second problem underneath the statistics, in the dirt itself. In the lower part of that layer in Area A, below the key date, what's there is mostly débetats and fragments of bone, flakes and scraps. That's real evidence of people, but it is not a formal toolkit. There were no finished, diagnostic, unmistakably shaped tools at the very bottom. If the deepest material is loose flakes and bone chips, how do you know they were dropped there and didn't just work their way down? Because sediment moves. Roots grow through it. Rodents burrow into it. Pits dug in a later period cut down through earlier layers and mix them. Small objects migrate. And a flake is exactly the kind of object that migrates well. It's small, it's flat, and it weighs almost nothing. Drop one on a surface, then give it 15,000 years of roots and burrows and freezing and thawing, and there is no guarantee that the depth you find it at is the depth it started at. That is not a hostile argument. That is the first thing anyone digging ground this old is taught to worry about. That whole family of problems has a name: stratigraphic integrity, and in 2022, Suravel and his colleagues published a survey in PLOS One ranking how well the very early sites in the Americas hold up on it. Cooper's Ferry came out in the middle of that pack, not the top. And then a second group made a much harder version of the same argument. Fiedel, Potter, Morrow, Fott, Haynes, and Chatters published in the journal Paleoamerica across 2020 and 2021, and their position was not that the model was shaky at the edges. Their position was that the oldest occupation anyone had actually demonstrated at Cooper's Ferry was somewhere around 11,500 years ago, and that everything older than that was ambiguous. 11,500 against 16,000. That is two groups of professionals looking at the same hillside and disagreeing by more than 4,000 years. So which of them was measuring the site wrong? Fiedel and his colleagues were not saying the older material doesn't exist. They were drawing a line between what has been demonstrated and what has been modeled, and refusing to count anything on the far side of that line. It's a conservative standard, and by that standard almost every very early site in the Americas comes down in age. That bar was raised on purpose. The history of this question is full of sites announced as impossibly old that quietly stopped getting mentioned, and the people holding the line at Cooper's Ferry had watched that happen before. And if the points coming out of that terrace are not Clovis, where did that way of making them come from? They went after the Japan connection too. Some of the Cooper's Ferry points resemble tools from the late Ice Age in Hokkaido, in northern Japan, and the excavators raised that likeness as a possible technological link. Their critics argued the resemblance was thin, and separate work on ancient teeth and DNA has pushed back hard on the idea that the peopling of the Americas came out of Japan. It stays a hypothesis wearing a question mark, and it is not settled. Davis and his colleagues replied to both. In Science in 2020, and in Paleo America with Madsen in 2021, defending the model and the stratigraphy. So how do you settle an argument about a calculation? Not by running the calculation again. Instead of answering in print a third time, they went back to Area B and dug. December 2022. Science advances. 3 pits. In the site records they are F78, F108, and F151, and every one of them sits wholly inside the layer in question, rather than cutting down into it from above. Out of them came 14 stemmed projectile points. A pit is a different kind of evidence from a layer, and the difference comes down to edges. When somebody digs a hole, the hole cuts the ground. Sediment that was lying in flat bands gets sliced through, and the side of that cut stays visible for thousands of years as a line in the dirt, because whatever fills the hole afterward is different material, packed a different way from what it was dug into. An excavator standing in the trench can find that line with the edge of a trowel and follow it down. And as long as the top of the pit stops inside the layer instead of cutting up through it, everything sitting in the fill went in while that layer was still the ground surface. Nothing drifts into a sealed pit from above without breaking that line. The line is not broken. So the 2 objections that had real force against loose flakes have nothing to hold on to here. Nobody was disputing that there was old material at Cooper's Ferry. The dispute was whether it was really left by people, and whether it had stayed where it was put. 14 finished, deliberately shaped points, lying in holes that people dug on purpose, with datable bone in the same fill, answer both of those at once. The bone dates from those pits clustered in the range of about 15,900 to 15,600 years, and the assemblage as a whole came out around 15,800. That is the number on the object in the photograph, and it is not an extrapolation past the evidence. It is a date on bone that was lying in the same fill as the points. It does not settle the 16,000-year figure, and it was never going to. That number is still a model, and models are still arguable. What it does is put a hard floor under Cooper's Ferry that sits thousands of years below Clovis, carried by finished tools in sealed features. So the fight over the dates has an answer, at least at the bottom, which leaves the question the dates were never going to touch. Whose village was that? Nakia Williamson is the Nez Perce Cultural Resources Director, and in August of 2019, the week the first paper came out, he told the Lewiston Tribune what the site was. He said this was not an anonymous Paleo-Indian site with unknown people on it. In his words, this is a site that was inhabited by Nez Perce. So what changes when the place you are excavating already has a name? And there is no story in that tradition about arriving from somewhere else. No migration account. The knowledge, as it is held and passed down, is that they have been in that country. Williamson noted that the name may relate to a woman's term for a little brother, and there is a story attached, which he was careful to introduce with the words, "Some have surmised." An avalanche came down and destroyed a village, and 2 children survived it, a young girl and a younger boy. A related tribal statement puts it slightly differently, that Nipéhe was founded by a young couple after a flood destroyed the place they had been living. The same on-camera account describes Nipéhe as a winter village. A winter village is not somewhere you pass through. It's where you go when the weather turns and you need the salmon, the shelter of the canyon, and stored food to get you through to spring. That describes people who knew that ground well enough to depend on it in the worst part of the year. And it lines up with what came out of the excavation, which is storage pits, a hearth, and the ordinary debris of people staying put. So what is knowledge like that actually good for, if it can't hand you a year? Now, that is not a radiocarbon date, and it is not trying to be. Oral tradition is not doing the job a laboratory does. It is doing a different job, and it is doing it in a place where the laboratory has been arguing with itself for 3 years. And there is one more thing the Nez Perce account carries, which is a list of places. When Nez Perce speakers describe the ancestral villages, there is a set of 3 original places, and a tribal speaker, on camera, at the site, made the point that Cooper's Ferry was not among those 3. So how does a place end up being one of the oldest dated villages on the continent, and still not be one of the first villages in the memory of the people whose country it's in? The archaeology has spent years establishing that this shelf was occupied around 15 to 16,000 years ago, which would make it one of the oldest, securely dated places anybody has ever lived in the Americas. And the tradition attached to that same country says, in effect, that this one was not the beginning, that it was not among the first places, that the older ones are somewhere else. So if this is not the oldest place in that tradition, what is, and where is it? Archaeology cannot answer that one. It can only say where this place ranks among the sites it has actually found. Is Cooper's Ferry the oldest site in the Americas? No. There are footprints at White Sands in New Mexico that have been dated far older by 2 independent methods. There is Monte Verde, at the bottom of Chile, at roughly 14,500 years. Cooper's Ferry belongs in that conversation, near the top of the securely dated column, and the honest phrasing is among the earliest dated sites, or the oldest so far. But the corridor timing does not care where Cooper's Ferry ranks. It only cares that the site is inland, and that people were standing on it before the inland road existed. If people were on that terrace before the ice-free corridor was passable, they did not walk down the middle of the continent, which leaves the coast, come down the Pacific edge by water, past ice that ends at the shoreline, and you arrive at the mouth of the Columbia, which is the first major river draining a country that isn't under ice. Follow it inland. It takes you to the Snake. The Snake takes you to the Salmon. The Salmon takes you to a bench of flat ground above the water, at the mouth of a creek, with a long view down the canyon. You end up exactly where that photograph was taken. So if people really came that way, why has nobody found the camps they left along the coast? The rest of that route is underwater. At the height of the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice that the sea stood hundreds of feet lower than it does today. The edge of the land was not where you see it on a map now. It was miles further out. Everything between that old shoreline and the modern beach was dry country, with river mouths and gravel bars and flats above the tide line, which is exactly the kind of ground a group moving down a coast sleeps on, eats on, and leaves things behind on. Then the ice melted, and the water came back over all of it. So the camps are not missing. They are down there, under a few hundred feet of cold Pacific, and the reason the coastal evidence looks thin is that almost nobody has been able to go and look. So the point in the palm goes back to the tray, and the tray goes back into a drawer, and somewhere on that drawer there's a catalog number. Somebody made it. They shaped the stem so it would seat into a shaft, ran the flaking across both faces to thin it, and carried it out onto a terrace above the salmon to hunt with, and then they lost it, or broke it, or left it behind. It went into the silt. Silt kept arriving on top of it, a little at a time, for 15,000 years, and groundwater laid a crust of mineral over the surface while it waited. Nobody was supposed to see it again. The only reason anybody did is that a man put a trench in the wrong hillside in 1961 and could not answer his own question, and somebody else came back 60 years later with the tools to finish it. And the people whose country that is have been saying the whole time that their story does not start there. So what do you think is still sitting in the ground at the places their tradition points to, that nobody has dug yet? Leave your answer in the comments. And when you're ready for more lost evidence, click the video on screen to watch more.